So, Professor Blättler, climate change has always taken place. Why is this time any different?
So I think there's two important lessons we can take, two important points about why this is different. The first one is that the rate of change we're experiencing right now is far greater than anything that we know of that has naturally happened. And so just as an example, the most recent dramatic event of climate change that we know of in the geological record is the end of the ice ages, right? The ice ages came and went over the last 3 million years or so. And there's a pattern to the ice ages. They would slowly get colder and slowly grow their ice sheets, and then quite dramatically and rapidly melt again. And during this melting of the ice ages, sea level rose by about 4 to 5 meters a year, so really dramatic rate of change. During that period when the ice ages were ending, we also had CO2 rising that helped to drive it. And the rate of CO2 increase during those, the ends of ice ages was still 1,000 times slower than what we are experiencing now. So even these really dramatic periods of change that the Earth has experienced naturally occurred very much more slowly than what we're experiencing now. We're really forcing the planet in a really extreme way. And so the rate of change is one thing that makes this period really different. I think the other point that makes this time different is the stakes, because we have close to 8 billion people on the planet, and we've relied upon a stable climate to develop plans for agriculture, for our industry, our economies. And so the planet will be fine, give us a couple million years. Lots of parts of the planet will be fine, but it is our societies and our dependence on the climate system we have that's really at stake and makes it really different.
So how do we know what climate was like millions of years ago? How do you measure temperature, the temperature that existed several millennia or million of years ago? How do you go about that?
There's a few ways that we can do it. One is by some simple qualitative measures. So we know there were ice ages because we can find glacial features in our landscape here. Here in Chicago, we actually used to have a lake bed. There used to be several hundred meters of ice over where we are sitting right now. And we can find traces of that on the landscapes. We can find fossils of species adapted to warm and cold climates at different places. So that's one of the simple, basic ways that we know about ancient climates. And then another way is that the chemistry of certain fossils actually changes as they grow in different temperature conditions. There's organic molecules that change their composition in warm or cold climates. And there's also a relationship in calcium carbonate minerals. And I brought actually a specimen of these little single-celled fossils called foraminifera. And the composition of the oxygen that's in their shells changes as a function of temperature. And so we can go and we can collect sediments from the ocean floor where they accumulate in layers going back millions of years. And when we measure these in the laboratory, we can find out the temperature at which they grew. And this is how we know about the periodic cycles of the ice ages. And this record can go back about 150 million years. And then beyond that, we can also use the rock record that we have on our continents. We can also collect materials that tell us about the temperature where they grew. So afterwards, I'll invite you to look at this. I have a lens here that will help you see the features of these beautiful fossils.
But they're not allowed to open up the
No, please no. I'd like to take these back with me.
Okay. So what can paleoclimatology, which is a mouthful, what can that teach us?
So by looking at periods when the climate changed in the past, we can get an understanding of some of the processes that are involved, some of the feedbacks, and the timescales over which these elements of the Earth system might change, right? I said this is a really rapid period of change that we're experiencing right now. And there's parts of the Earth system that respond over a few decades. There's parts of the Earth system that respond over 1,000 years. There's parts of the Earth system that respond over 100,000 years. So I think one of the important lessons is the inertia in the system and the really long time scale over which the Earth recovers. So for example, there was a period of really rapid climate change around 56 million years ago. This is a very famous event that we recognize in fossils such as these. And as I said, the Earth was fine, it recovered. There was not a major extinction event, actually. The Earth's natural system of recovering for this is to remove the excess CO2 in the atmosphere into minerals like these ones, calcium carbonate. And that process took about 100,000 years. So the CO2 that is now accumulating in our atmosphere, even if we stop emitting tomorrow, it's not going to go away next year, it's not going to go away in a decade. It's going to be in our atmosphere for thousands of years. And so we have to plan for the arc of what these future climates are going to be, because the time scale of response is really so long. The ocean, for example, cycles about once every 1,000 years. And so the ocean acidification that we're seeing right now, that will start to penetrate in the deep ocean. And the ocean's role also in modulating climate change, that is only going to start to take place in about 1,000 years. So we are really seeing just the beginning of change, and we can examine some of these ancient deposits to figure out the timescale of how parts of the Earth system might respond.
What are the long-term dynamics of the carbon cycle under current emissions if we don't do anything?
If we don't do anything, well, actually, let's say we do something. Let's say we just cut emissions tomorrow. I said the carbon is still going to exist in our atmosphere for a long time. It will slowly make its way into the ocean. It will acidify the ocean. That will have an impact on marine life, as well as the impact on terrestrial life from increased temperatures and also changes in weather patterns and the water cycle, right? Droughts and floods and things like that. So we expect that those cycles will take place over a couple thousand years. Those changes will penetrate all those parts of the Earth system. Eventually, the Earth does have natural ways of removing carbon and recovering states. And this mostly relies upon weathering reactions when CO2 and water react with rocks in the Earth's crust. And through these reactions, we deliver ions to the ocean that can then remove carbon back into a solid phase, into these kinds of minerals. And so over a long time scale, I said the Earth's going to be fine, carbon's going to be removed again into solid phases out of our oceans and our atmosphere, but it's going to take several tens of thousands of years, maybe 100,000 years.
Can you elaborate on the ocean's role in the carbon cycle?
Yeah, so the ocean is actually a gigantic reservoir of carbon. There's about 50 times more carbon dissolved in the oceans than in the atmosphere. And so the chemical balance between the atmosphere and the ocean is really important for setting the level of CO2 that remains in the atmosphere, and therefore the climate that we have. And the ocean also stores a lot of extra carbon in the deeper parts of the ocean that we don't really experience in a day-to-day life. The surface ocean exchanges carbon with the atmosphere, but there's also places where water from the surface sinks down and fills the deep ocean basins. And this water can be stored down there for about 1,000 years. And actually, the marine biology is involved in the cycle too, because algae that live in the surface ocean, they will do photosynthesis and they will make their bodies out of carbon. And then when they die and sink, that carbon actually gets stored in the deep sea. And so we have extra carbon stored in our deep sea that is useful for us, because if that all circulated back to the atmosphere, then we would have even more global warming than we have right now. So we are grateful for the ocean circulation, this natural process. It stores carbon away from our atmosphere. But this means also that small changes in ocean circulation can bring this carbon back up to the surface and affect the balance in our atmosphere. So ocean circulation is driven by temperature, by some of our weather patterns. And so as we are seeing changes in our climate, we're also concerned about changes in ocean circulation that might make it even worse, because this carbon that's stored right now deep away from the atmosphere might come back up to the surface and increase our atmospheric concentration.
Can you tell us a little bit about the geoengineering strategies to help remove CO2?
Yeah, so this has been a topic of increasing interest lately. We are facing pretty extreme change in the future, and people are trying to develop strategies to intentionally engineer the climate system, engineer the Earth system to remove it, to recover something that's more similar to the stable climate we have had. And there are two main ways in which we've tried to do this. The planet's temperature is impacted by how much radiation we receive from the sun. And so there are some ideas that are quite controversial, actually, in terms of how they might be implemented and what the effects would be, to increase the amount of light that our Earth reflects back to space so that we stay cooler, and we absorb less of that energy. And this would involve strategies like spraying aerosols into the stratosphere, where they might stay for a couple years floating around in the upper atmosphere and reflect a little bit of sunlight. So if 1 or 2% less sunlight reaches the surface of our planet, we could stay cooler, even with all the carbon we've been emitting. So that's one class of strategies for geoengineering, as it's called. And the other main source of geoengineering ideas is to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere on a really broad scale. And again, we could try to capture CO2 right out of the air. That's not terribly efficient. It's hard to do, but people are trying to do it. And the other way that people are trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere is actually the same way that the Earth naturally removes CO2 from the atmosphere. This process of weathering rocks in the crust and putting them into the ocean so they will form minerals like these ones. And so I said that the Earth naturally goes through this process in about 100,000 years. But if we have ways of accelerating this process, we may be able to help that reaction draw CO2 out of the atmosphere more quickly. And there's some ideas to grind up some really reactive rocks, for example, and spread them on agricultural fields or spread them in the oceans where this reaction might be accelerated. And it may help to return CO2 into a solid phase as opposed to leaving it in our atmosphere.
So which version would you favor?
I think I should say I don't favor any active geoengineering strategies right now. There's a lot of political discussions about if we might want to do this at all, how we want to do it. I don't think we have good political structures and governance structures in order to control, regulate, decide on these kinds of processes. That's the job of diplomats and politicians, not scientists like me. But I would say that the mechanism of removing CO2 by reaction with rocks, that is a very natural way that the Earth system works. And so I would favor that one over any attempt to put something to our stratosphere, because we do understand a little bit more directly how it works, and it wouldn't have the wide-reaching consequences on Earth's radiation and possibly Earth's weather on different parts of the planet. So that is a slightly more natural way to think about removing CO2. It is still very early in testing phases to see if this can be done at a scale to make it effective, but I think it's a very interesting avenue for research.
We're noticing in Switzerland the effects of permafrost, where actually mountain railways are shifting, that the foundation of alpine huts are shifting. How do you see this issue long term with permafrost, also in Siberia, the melting?
Yeah. So melting permafrost is one of these factors that could potentially represent a positive feedback. So it could represent a change that then allows global warming to become even more severe and encourage more change. So in addition to the infrastructure issues that you mentioned, one thing that scientists are very concerned about too is that when permafrost melts, you often get these tundra areas that are waterlogged, and those are perfect places for bacteria to produce methane. And methane is also a very powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful than CO2. And it's at the moment very much unknown how these permafrost regions might respond to melting, how the microbial communities in there might start to produce methane or might start to consume methane. And so there's a potential for these newly melted permafrost areas to become large sources of methane and contribute to more global warming. So that's something that people are concerned about and encouraged to study then the microbial ecology of those regions. There will of course be other ecological changes that happen across those regions, as is happening all over the world.
What did we learn about climate change during the COVID pandemic?
So it's interesting. In the COVID pandemic, I don't know what people might assume. A lot of people stopped traveling, stopped driving, stopped flying, right? So maybe you have thought this is a great thing for climate change. And on a local scale, I think that the COVID pandemic did have a lot of positive effects for nature and ecology. We definitely had reduced pollution in some urban environments. Wildlife and certain ecosystems seemed to respond very well. However, even despite all the decreased activity and travel that we experienced, global CO2 has continued to rise almost, you can almost not detect a drop in our CO2 emissions. And so I think this is also a concerning observation. It means that most of our CO2 emissions are tied up in just our basic habits of life, our infrastructure, our housing, our heating, our cooling, our major industry, manufacturing. And so these small choices that we have in our individual lives about driving and traveling, yes, maybe you've heard you're tracking your carbon footprint, trying to fly a bit less. It does matter, but it's actually a very, very small amount of the global CO2 emissions that we have. So there's really a lot of CO2 that's just coming out of our basic economy, our basic habitat. So we need to do something on a bigger scale to tackle those emissions, even with all the behavior changes we saw during lockdown.
What feedbacks might help to accelerate or decelerate future climate change?
We talked about some of these feedbacks already. So permafrost melting might increase methane. That may have an accelerating effect on climate change. Another accelerating effect on climate change could be the melting of glaciers and ice caps. These also serve to alter the energy of the planet because they reflect a lot of sunlight back to space. They're very bright and white. And when they retreat, when they melt back, then the area is no longer covered by something that's so white and bright. And so more of the energy coming into the planet gets absorbed and can help to increase the temperature. And that would help more melt to occur. So the loss of ice and its impact on the reflection of energy on the planet is one other feedback we're kind of worried about. I mentioned already the biology of the oceans is actually helpful to us. It helps to store carbon away in the deep ocean, away from accumulating in the atmosphere. And our pollution of the oceans and also ocean acidification is changing those ecosystems in the ocean, which might make the ocean less able to absorb carbon from our atmosphere. There's a similar effect actually happening on land. So of all the carbon we emit, only about half of it actually stays in our atmosphere, which is good news for us. Some of it goes into the oceans, and some of it actually is taken up by land, in vegetation, in soils, and other places. And this has been very helpful. If all the carbon we emitted stayed in the atmosphere, again, we'd have about twice as much global warming as we do right now. But those feedbacks are also decreasing. So that's been helping us for a little while to remove the very worst effects of our emissions. But now that capacity of the land surface to absorb carbon is also decreasing, which will only make future climate change even more extreme. So none of that was really good news. We have several ways in which we're predicting that future climate's going to be even more extreme, even more warm.
Well, on that positive note, I think we should open it up for questions from our audience. Everybody is doom and gloom.
Just a quick question on that. So the negative overall effect is just temperature. Is that really, can you break down?
Not exactly. Negative for what?
In fact, if you could spray some aerosols, then we could reduce the effect. And essentially, it's all about the temperature in the end. Is that really the high level observable that we?
That is one of the observables we have. The reason why this is so controversial is it's not the only effect. Okay. So reflecting energy from the stratosphere will also change energy distribution around the planet. It will affect distribution of moisture, so weather patterns. They'll have probably areas where it rains more, areas where it rains less. And so drought and flood are also thought to be important side effects of this kind of a strategy. And one of the reasons why it's a much more risky proposition than some other ways of just removing carbon.
Other questions? Yes.
So I'm just wondering on your comments on the fires lately with Canada. I'm from California, so the amount of fires we have and the amount of fires happening in Canada up north now, how is it affecting the atmosphere? And from what I'm gauging, it's going to take 100,000 years again to deal with the CO2 coming out from that atmosphere. So just wondering your comments on that.
So the fires obviously released some CO2 to the atmosphere. You had wood burning, and you're right, that was a CO2 source. That is a very, very small component of the CO2 that our industrial emissions are producing. So the more severe effect of those fires is to air quality, right? The smog, the particles that we're breathing in, and those have a very clear link to mortality. So that's the real concern about the fires. But with increased temperatures and increased drought, yes, we do expect frequencies of fires to increase in certain places. Another strange side effect that's related to fires is that we are actually cleaning up a lot of other parts of industrial pollution. So in addition to emitting CO2, we've also emitted a lot of small particles, sulfate particles, the kinds of particles that make up smog. And those particles actually have the same effect as these stratospheric aerosols might have. They reflect some sunlight and help to cool our atmosphere a little bit. So paradoxically, as we are cleaning up our atmosphere from some of those really dirty particles, those pollutants, we're actually making global warming a little bit worse. So the local pollution has actually kept us a little bit cooler than we otherwise would be. So there's a lot of interconnected effects here with environmental change, the CO2 problem, and also local pollution and smog and particles.
Ms. Ward?
Yeah, I'm wondering, where are you optimistic? What gives you hope? I work in a museum where we deal with a lot of families and kids, particularly trying to interest them in science, technology, be inspired to get engaged, do something. What do you say to people, family, friends, people that are not scientists, that are not deeply engaged in this? What gives you hope that we can turn this around?
So some of these geoengineering strategies, I think, are really hopeful. And I said there's a complicated set of questions about ethics and politics and governance about them. But we have a lot of clever, creative humans who are working on these strategies. And some of them we know come from nature itself, are ways that the natural Earth system, natural reactions progress and then help to remove CO2. So I am optimistic that we will continue to put our efforts towards some of those strategies, and that we may find ways of removing some CO2 and making the problem less severe. And I'm also optimistic that our diplomats in the world may create some structures for how we, as a globe, can try to strategize for how to reduce emissions effectively. These are big questions, but we have a lot of people working sincerely on these problems, and so there is hope for what we might create.
Which of these geoengineering solutions do you think has the most capacity to scale up and be really impactful?
I know of one that I can talk about, which I think is quite clever. It again relies upon this natural weathering reaction of rocks that will eventually form calcium carbonate. And it takes advantage of the fleet of vessels that is currently sailing the world's oceans, which can easily take up water as they travel through the seas and react it. They have high temperatures naturally because of their engines, and then they can put the seawater back into the oceans. And as they sail around, this will be naturally diluted and disseminated through the world's oceans. Because we have a large fleet of vessels, you could imagine installing these and helping this reaction to scale over that fleet. The other really advantageous thing about that is that there's a clear way to measure what's coming out of the effluent of a ship. Some of these other strategies you can imagine are very hard to monitor and to regulate. If someone wanted to put something in the stratosphere, how do you figure out exactly what effect that's having on the other side of the world, right? If you spread minerals all over the ocean surface, how do you figure out exactly how much is reacting before they get washed away or sink away? So if you're doing a controlled reactor on a vessel, there's also a little bit better way to test the impact it's having. And that's one of these strategies that I think I'm looking forward to hearing more about. Yeah.
Philip?
Yeah, great presentation. I was wondering if you had any recommendations for the average, for example, Chicago citizen, if they can do something to help make the anthropogenic impact on climate smaller, since you mentioned the impact on car travel, air travel is small. What else can they do to help?
So because all the travel component is pretty small, there's obviously things we can do with travel, right? Electric vehicles, more transit, all these things. But infrastructure is a big one. So home heating and cooling, right? If you have a lot of a leaky home, that's a lot of air, a lot of energy that's wasted to heat and cool. And so some of the home improvements, building improvements, infrastructure improvements can go a long way towards reducing energy in your day-to-day life.
Any other?
My question is about on sociology. Do you think
Maybe I'll ask him to answer this one.
it's reasonable for young generations that my personal experience, I learned since few times ago, a new word, eco-anxiety. Is it reasonable for young generations to be eco-anxious?
I don't know if it's reasonable. I think it's understandable. We were discussing this earlier, weren't we? And one of the strategies that I try to use is that you understand where this anxiety comes from because you're worried about a future world which is not going to be as prosperous, as livable, as stable as this one. So we are, in some ways, we are worried about those future humans and their happiness. And it doesn't make sense to me to kill all of our present happiness in exchange for the ones in the future, right? If we want a world that is sustainable, that is easier to live in, happier for the future, then we also owe it to them to enjoy what we have right now. And so I don't think living in a state of doom and gloom is really useful. We should also we should hope that we can live lives in the ways that we enjoy things about our lives. And we can also be aware of this and intentional about it and work towards it and support it in any way that we can. But yeah, if you respect your hopes for the future, then I think you also are responsible for living some of that yourself.
Is the photosynthesis of the plants just a small part then in binding the CO2 compared to the ocean?
Photosynthesis on land actually is very important, but it has a seasonal cycle. So most of the photosynthesis that occurs on land is in tree leaves, and when they fall down, they are broken down, they decay, and that CO2 goes right back to the atmosphere. So the cycle of plants doing photosynthesis and then respiring it again has no net change on the CO2. The way to remove CO2 would be to grow forests back where there were none before. So then that carbon is captured for at least a few decades, maybe centuries, however long those trees last. Or to take the wood and bury it. There's ideas about burying wood in places where it won't decay, putting organic matter, putting seaweed in the deep sea where it's stored away. So you can imagine ways in which you can take that photosynthesis and stash it away somewhere for a longer period of time. But the regular amount of photosynthesis that happens, most of that is just recycled right back to our atmosphere.
So one thing we can immediately do is come up with some new ideas, is have some Swiss wine. That usually helps. But I wanted to ask you, please join me in applause for Professor Blättler for a great presentation.